Okay, why don't we get started then? Really briefly first, for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, I just wanted to give a few words about Network 2020. So my name is Courtney Doggart. I'm the president of Network 2020. We are an inclusive international organization. We're a community that really tries to bridge the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy worlds. We do this through several different programs, ones that are both educational to our participants here in the US, like this virtual briefing series, and also participants around the world. We also run a deep dive on China. We run other programs like discussion groups. And in addition, we also run on the ground research too, which is basically our contribution and our way to leverage our network of established and emerging and entrepreneurial leaders. And so we're really trying to, again, bridge that gap between private sector and foreign policy. We are very lucky today to have Khaled Elgindy talk to us. And the genesis behind this talk really is one with the latest round of fighting between the Palestinians and Israelis having at least come to a ceasefire. What I wanted to do was not look just at that situation, but broaden it. And this is why I asked Khaled to speak by himself to really talk about, what does it mean to be a Palestinian? And what are the political options for Palestinians? What is the humanitarian situation for all the different groups among the Palestinians? And so I wanted us to really just take a big step back rather than kind of jumping from moment to moment and crisis to crisis and really understand where we're at. So we're very lucky to have him with us. He is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where he's director of the program on Palestine and Israeli-Palestinian affairs. He's also written a book that really looks at the relationship between the United States and the Palestinians, published by Brookings, which is on there. I'm not going to read the rest of his bio. I'm assuming that you have, but he is very enmeshed in this topic, and we're very, very lucky to have him with us today. So with that, welcome, Khaled. Thank you so much for being here. Where I usually like to start these conversations is with a little bit of context setting. And in this case, I really feel like we need to take a step back and not look just at context so much, but at terminology, actually. And there are a lot of terms that we use when it comes to this topic that I think have often lost their meaning. And so could you just start us off by injecting some nuance and understanding into the terms that are frequently used that I just use now, like Palestinians and Israel versus Palestine? What are the different groups within the term Palestinians, for example, and what are the comparative humanitarian and political situations within each group? And why do you think that the term Israelis versus Palestinians needs more context? So we can kick it off with some terminology.
Great, thank you, Courtney, and thank you to Network 2020 for having me, and thank you all for attending. I thought it would be a good idea to sort of take a kind of 50,000 foot approach, a view approach first. And I have a slide, which will be the only slide that I use, so I won't bore you guys with a full PowerPoint, but I think this one gives a pretty good overview of the situation in the land. People call it by different names. Israel/Palestine has sort of come into vogue recently because it is not two states, but there is still an expectation that someday there might be a two-state solution. This particular graphic was produced by Human Rights Watch, and I'll just kind of summarize what you all are looking at. So today there are about 13.6 million people living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. If we could go ahead and just highlight the outlines here, just to make it a little bit clearer, this is the land that we're talking about. This is Israel/Palestine, AKA Israel and the occupied territories, AKA historic Palestine, AKA Greater Israel. But this is the area that we're talking about. The population is almost evenly split between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. Israeli Jews across the land are more or less of the same legal and political status. They are all citizens of the state of Israel, regardless of where they live. That includes those who live in the occupied territories. And they can move about freely. And of course, they vote directly for the government, as we saw repeatedly Israeli elections in the last few years. The Palestinians, again, about almost an equal number of Palestinians to Israeli Jews. The Palestinians are divided into 4 different legal / political categories. The first are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. About 1.5 million or 1.6 million of them who vote in Israeli elections, who carry Israeli passports. They are the descendants of the Palestinians who did not leave in 1948 when Israel was created. In 1948, about 2/3 of the Palestinian Arab population fled the country in the course of Israel's creation. They became refugees in neighboring countries. And the remaining third basically became citizens and today number around 1.6 million. Then you have Palestinians in the occupied territories, and there are 3 different statuses, 3 different groups, each with a different set of rights. I should add that Palestinian citizens of Israel really consider themselves to be second and even third-class citizens. Because Israel defines itself as a Jewish state, it clearly privileges Jews over non-Jews. There is sort of built-in discrimination in the Israeli political and legal system. Now, in terms of those in the occupied territories, there's a bit of a hierarchy. Palestinians in East Jerusalem, about 400,000 of them are, again, they're not citizens of Israel. They are considered resident aliens of Israel because Israel annexed East Jerusalem, even though it's technically part of the West Bank. But they have the ability to move about much more freely than West Bank Palestinians or those in, certainly those in Gaza. They can fly in and out of the Israeli airport, for example, which is a privilege that Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza do not have. They have to travel by land, either to Egypt to travel abroad or to Jordan to the airport there. Then you have the 2.7 million West Bank Palestinians. They're labeled here West Bank ID holders because Palestinians have different Israeli issued ID cards, West Bank, East Jerusalem, or Gaza. In the West Bank, the PA has jurisdiction over, you can kind of see the dark red inside the pink of the West Bank. This is the areas that the Palestinian Authority has some limited autonomy and jurisdiction over the population, whereas Israel controls the rest of, about more than 60% of the West Bank, the Israeli military to be specific. Then you have the 2.1 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip who have been under a blockade since 2007. And so basically, no one and nothing gets in and out of Gaza without Israeli permission. So what does it mean to live under occupation, focusing on the 5.2 million or so Palestinians who are in the occupied territories? Legally speaking, military occupation is a temporary condition that is governed by international humanitarian law. Of course, Israel's occupation has gone on for more than half a century. We've now just crossed the 54-year mark. Under international law, the occupying power is responsible for the well-being of the population that it occupies. Part of that responsibility is to not transfer elements of your own population into the occupied territories. This is part of the international rules-based order that emerged after World War II that when an army occupies another country's territory, they cannot settle it, they can't colonize it. They have to maintain the status quo essentially, except for what is absolutely required for military and security purposes. Of course, we know that Israel has quite aggressively colonized the West Bank and Jerusalem. About 700,000 or so Israeli settlers live throughout the West Bank and Jerusalem. In practice, occupation functions a little bit like a military dictatorship, which is a very familiar concept in the region, of course, where there are severe limitations on human, civil, political rights. There really isn't a reliable system of rule of law that you can rely on. It is the army rules. The army sets the rules, and Palestinians are tried in military courts, and it is, I think, as arbitrary a system of rule as you can imagine. In some ways, it's actually worse than a traditional military dictatorship because the subject population are not actually citizens of the state that rules over them. So Egypt, for example, is a classic case of a military dictatorship. But of course, Egyptians, the Egyptian population, they're all citizens of the same government that that rules over them. So it's different in this case, and it's also different in the sense that you have this colonial project that is part and parcel of the occupation. As I said, 700,000 Israeli settlers, and it really is a system that is designed to fragment, dispossess, marginalize Palestinians to the benefit of the settler population. And so you have a two-tiered system. You have a system of Israelis who live in the occupied territories, who are full citizens, who can move freely. They're governed by civilian law. And then you have the 5.5 or 5.2 million Palestinians who are governed by Israeli military law, with severe restrictions on their access to natural resources, their ability to move about freely, and so on. So this reality is what has led groups like Human Rights Watch and Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem and others to characterize this situation as one of apartheid. It's a legal definition. It is not intended to imply that somehow the situation in Israel and Palestine is identical to apartheid South Africa. Although the term itself was coined as an Afrikaner word, but it is a situation that is defined by international law. And according to human rights groups, Israel and its rule over this kind of very separate and unequal system of rule is one of apartheid. I think that probably gives a good summary of the situation on the ground.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Just really quickly before we move on, you had mentioned, of course, that there were Palestinians who left early on. Would you be able to just touch really briefly on, for example, I know there are a lot of Palestinians in Jordan. Like what is the status of Palestinian refugees who are now in other countries?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. It's a good question because people often forget about the refugees when we think about the situation between Israel and Palestine. So as I said, about 2/3 of the Palestinian Arab population fled the country or was forced to flee in 1948. About 750,000 or so at the time. They now number around somewhere between 5 and 7 million. So let's say around 6 million refugees, depending on how you count. A very, very large number ended up in Jordan, which is, obviously just across the Jordan River In fact, a majority of Jordan's population are Palestinian, mostly descended from those who fled in 1948. A fair amount are also descended from Palestinians who, there was another wave of flights by Palestinian refugees in 1967. About 200,000 to 300,000 Palestinians left in 67 when Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, along with the Syrian Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai. But the bulk of the refugee population are descended from the 1948 refugees, and they are scattered in refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, to a lesser extent, Egypt. And in some cases, they've been, integrated in Gulf states. In the West, there is a sizable Palestinian diaspora in Europe and in North and South America as well. So there's probably about 7 million Palestinians who are outside of the area of the map that we saw, roughly equal to the size of the Palestinian population inside. And so a resolution of the refugee problem actually is the original Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Before Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, this was what was defined as the Arab-Israeli or Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is how do we find a resolution to this refugee problem? Of course, Palestinians insist on that they have, under international law, a right to return to their homes. That is a right that Israel has pretty much from the outset, from the moment that the refugees left, they've indicated they're not prepared to allow any refugees to go back.
Okay, thank you. That helps, I think, get a much better sense of the numbers and where Palestinians are. Turning now to domestic politics within the Palestinian groups. One theme that we've been hearing often in the US is that Fatah is fractured and that Hamas is taking advantage of this vacuum. What are your thoughts on the political leadership of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza? And is it reflective of the needs of the different groups of the Palestinians that you mentioned earlier?
It's a great question. And before I answer it, I want to give a little bit more context in terms of Palestinian political institutions. A lot of people are familiar with the Palestinian Authority, and there's another body called the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. And there's very often confusion between the PA and the PLO. They're sometimes used interchangeably. And there are some good reasons for that. It is somewhat confusing. So let me just sort of delineate what these two institutions are and then get into a little bit about Hamas and Fatah. So the PLO is the original political address of the Palestinian national movement worldwide, representing refugees outside as well as Palestinians in the occupied territories. And at one point, they even represented Palestinian citizens of Israel. It is the kind of pan-Palestinian political address for the Palestinian national movement. It is the PLO that was recognized by the United Nations in 1974. I should say the PLO was created in 1964. It is made up of a number of political factions and other institutions that together are supposed to be representative of the entire Palestinian national movement. So when the Palestinians have an embassy or a mission in a foreign capital, it is the PLO that represents them. It is the PLO that negotiates with Israel. It's not the Palestinian Authority. Again, there's confusion because the head of the PLO is Mahmoud Abbas, who also happens to be the head of the Palestinian Authority. And so they have kind of, in a way, merged. The expectation after Oslo, the Palestinian Authority was created with the Oslo Agreement as the center of Palestinian autonomy just for those Palestinians in the occupied territories. The who now number about 5 million or so Palestinians. And the expectation was that the Palestinian Authority would eventually graduate and become a full-fledged state. So in the process of the Oslo years throughout the 1990s, the PLO was sort of cannibalized, and its institutions and mechanisms were kind of transferred over to the Palestinian Authority in the expectation that it was a state in waiting, that one day, ideally by 1999, when the interim period was supposed to end, it would graduate and become a full-blown Palestinian state. Obviously, that didn't happen. And so the development of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, was sort of frozen in time. And the PLO, which had been sort of gutted, its internal institutions had been gutted to create the PA, was also sort of left in limbo. And so now we have this sort of weird bifurcated, overlapping and blurry lines between these two institutions. But again, they have the same leadership, and so it can often be very confusing. Now, the PLO is technically, Fatah is the dominant group in both the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. Fatah actually had been dominating the PLO since 1968 or 9, and it hasn't been like a strictly one-party system, but it is clearly the dominant force. And so there's an array of political factions from the left to the right, but the PLO was frozen around the late 1980s, around the same time that Hamas emerged. Hamas, being an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, came about. It was very significantly not integrated into the PLO like all of the other factions. So that raised questions about whether the PLO remained truly representative. And then, of course, after Oslo, Hamas grew stronger, and it boycotted the first elections of the Palestinian Authority in 1996. But then the second elections in 2006 decided to run, and it actually won a majority of the seats in the parliament of the Palestinian Authority. So right away we have this contradiction. We have a group, Hamas, that is violently opposed to the Oslo process, that has carried out attacks on Israeli civilians, that has other acts of violence, and they don't recognize the Palestinian Authority, but now they are part of it because they have a majority in the legislature. So that meant they had the ability to form a government. The government was boycotted by the international community, led by the United States and Israel. It eventually led to a civil war with the Fatah forces, and led to the current split. So that's just by way of context. So you have the two dominant forces, Hamas and Fatah, are really the bulk of all of the other factions, particularly the leftist factions, have pretty negligible bases of support. So these are the two dominant factions. It's hard to tell which one is stronger because we don't have an election. We were supposed to have elections this year, and they were canceled at the last moment by President Abbas, in part because of the question that you asked, because of this fracturing that is happening within Fatah itself. So like a lot of ruling parties that have been around for decades, Fatah has ossified and has become in a lot of ways corrupt. The fact that they are still in power after losing both an election and a civil war, I think tells you a lot about the sense of entitlement that has been cultivated by this group. You know, if you've never had to pay a price for your political failings, either in an election or through some other mechanism, then you get lazy. You lose touch with your grassroots base, and that is what has happened under the leadership of Mahmoud Abbas. Fatah, there is an entire generation of sort of a new cadre of leaders who are very dissatisfied with Mahmoud Abbas's increasingly authoritarian style. And Hamas, by comparison, you know, is not, we're not talking about a Jeffersonian, you know, democratic political party, but they are more disciplined. They are internally at least more democratic, more dynamic. There's been a change of leadership inside Hamas. They've had internal elections. We've seen leaders come and go, whereas Fatah, we see the exact same faces really that have dominated since even the 1960s. You know, Fatah is one of the oldest ruling parties in the entire Arab world. If you imagine, Fatah was created in 1959, and it's still dominating Palestinian politics. So there are lots of there are calls for reform within Fatah, and this stagnation and this division has only been reinforced by these internal problems within Fatah, because there isn't an incentive to reform, because that means having to compete, that means having to take political risks, whereas now there's just simply in power. And frankly, the Israelis and the United States and the international community is quite content with that status quo, because they don't want to see, because they see a loss of Fatah will mean a gain for Hamas, and they are not prepared to deal with Hamas in any serious way.
So it sounds like the options are, in some respect, are fairly limited if you're looking for kind of a dynamic, responsive political party that has a range of policy options.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll ask a couple more questions before we return to the Q&A box. And one is, I'd just like to take a step back, because I think what you've done really well is laid out just the shifting situation that's happened both politically and internally, as well as or sometimes not happening in the case of the Fatah. But I'd like to take a look at what's happening in the region, because I think that there's a lot of shifts that are also changing the calculus. And one of the major ones this past year has been the advancement of the Abraham Accords. So could you talk a little bit and elaborate on how the establishment of diplomatic relations with Israel by countries like the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, how that's affecting the Palestinians' political calculations, and how those countries that signed the accords have reacted to the latest violence in Gaza?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is that these normalization agreements are not peace treaties. They are sometimes called peace treaties, particularly by the people who orchestrated them. There was the big signing ceremony on the White House lawn that evoked images of Camp David, you know, the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, that famous handshake with Rabin and Arafat in Oslo. But so these are countries, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco. These are countries that have never been at war with Israel. They have refused to recognize Israel, more or less out of solidarity with the Palestinians. The pan-Arab position was consolidated in 2002 under the Arab Peace Initiative, which was pushed mainly by the Saudis, in which the Arab states collectively said, look, we are prepared to recognize Israel once and for all, and to integrate it into the community, into the region, and have normal trade, diplomatic, and other relations with Israel, but only after Israel has ended its occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and there is an independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital, and a just and agreed upon resolution for the refugee problem. That was the basic general formula. So obviously the UAE decision to normalize last year broke with that formula and arguably killed it. I mean, I think it's very hard to argue that the Arab Peace Initiative is somehow still relevant. Basically, what the UAE did, you know, the way I look at these normalization agreements is that they are one of the many trends that are working against the two-state solution. So it is essentially the Arab states saying, we have interests, we have bilateral interests with Israel, we have geopolitical, there's a convergence of interests strategically vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis Iran and its proxies in the region. There's a real interest in Israeli technology, particularly military and intelligence-related technology. There is an interest in doing trade with Israel. And so I look at these agreements as the Arab states saying, we can't just sit around, we have these interests, economic interests, other interests, we can't sit around waiting for this unicorn called the two-state solution. And so we're just going to forge ahead and skip over this whole Palestinian issue and normalize relations with Israel. For Netanyahu at the time and for the Trump administration, it was specifically designed, these normalization agreements are seen as positive in and of themselves, but they are also a way to bypass the Palestinian issue. Because for so long, the conventional wisdom was you can't make progress regionally. Israel can't really normalize regionally until it resolves the Palestinian problem. So this upended that logic, and Netanyahu is very happy with that, and so was the Trump administration, because they basically wanted to sideline the Palestinians and kind of force them to accept whatever what was being offered, which was essentially not a Palestinian state, but the Trump plan was basically a Bantustan model. It would be a bunch of disconnected Palestinian autonomous zones surrounded by and controlled by Israel under an Israeli security umbrella. Very, very similar to the Bantustans of South Africa. And so obviously Palestinians didn't want to play that game. They rejected it out of hand. So in that sense, it is, I think, the Arab states saying we need to move on. What this latest round of violence did, I think, was sort of embarrass those states that had pursued normalization agreements with Israel. One, because the Palestinian issue was simply supposed to disappear. It was supposed to fade away into the night. It was seen as a kind of internal Israeli matter. And that clearly wasn't the case. And also because Arab states, whatever they may say privately, publicly, they have to maintain a stance of solidarity with the Palestinians. And so this put the UAE and Bahrain in particular in a very awkward situation. They kept a very low profile during the fighting. So, but in general, I see these normalization agreements as, the conflict is changing. It's no longer an Arab-Israeli conflict. It is really a conflict. The fault lines are shifting. So, Palestinians used to rely on the Arab states as their kind of strategic depth. It was the Arab states who would push, whether it was Egypt or the Saudis, push the issue in Washington or in European capitals. That is kind of faded. But in its place, we're seeing a different kind of solidarity movement emerge in the West, in the United States, in Europe, that is more values-based. So it's no longer based on identity. You know, it's not an Arab-Jewish conflict. It's not an Arab-Israeli conflict, but people are viewing it in kind of moral terms of, you know, we cannot continue the situation of where the United States is basically complicit and supporting what Human Rights Watch and others call a situation of apartheid. And so Arab states who are not terribly interested in human rights and democracy, that doesn't resonate with them, but it does resonate with a large number of people in the West.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
even in Israel.
Yeah. Yeah, very good point. I was listening to a story the other day on NPR about how with the latest protest in support of Palestinians, like the whole makeup of the protesters have changed too, and a lot of that is, I think, a lot of solidarity with what's happening with the U.S. with Black Lives Matter, and so there's just a whole, like you said, I think that values alignment is really making itself clear. One final question before we turn to the Q&A box, and thank you for letting me I want to cover the full scope, because that last piece is one that you touched on, and this is the role of the U.S. And this is a question that came up in a briefing that we had with Michael Koplow a couple of weeks ago, and that's the role of, you know, what is the role of the U.S. as a broker, and you know, can they be perceived as I mean, maybe not a neutral broker, but what is their role as a broker and when it comes to this ongoing conflict, and what would an ideal role be in your mind?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that I wrote a book on because it is intriguing. The U.S. role is really kind of a bundle of contradictions. Michael and I probably would disagree. I mean, we have disagreed very amicably in other forums, but you know, I'll just sort of summarize my thoughts on how I see the American mediation role. So the expectation for the United States was never that they would be an even-handed or fair-minded broker. I think everybody understands the United States has a special relationship with Israel. It is always going to, I don't know about always, but for the moment anyway, it is solidly in Israel's corner. We hear that line, ironclad, unbreakable, unshakable bond with Israel from Republican and Democratic administrations alike. But ironically, it was that closeness with Israel that actually drew Arab states, and in particular the Palestinians, to the United States, because the understanding was, or the logic was, that only the United States can move Israel to take those steps. You know, they're the only party really that can influence the Israelis to take the steps that are needed to bring about a Palestinian state. And so the PLO from the 1970s onward began to pursue the United States in various ways. That culminated eventually in the late 1980s with a dialogue, and then in the Oslo process formally when the US recognized, actually the PLO is never recognized, the United States has never recognized officially the PLO, and the PLO is still officially considered a terrorist organization under US law. But at least they were willing to normalize on some level with and deal with the PLO. So American mediation is very unique from your standard mediation models. In a normal mediation setting, you look at things like the power dynamics between the two sides. Obviously, in asymmetrical conflicts have to be dealt with differently than two states of more or less equal power. And also you have to look at the internal politics of each sides, and the role of the mediators to assess what incentives and disincentives can push the parties to take the kinds of actions that promote the goals of the process, and to avoid actions that harm the goals of the process. And that's not at all how American mediation has worked. American mediation has operated on a totally separate plane. It's it's formulaic in American policy that Israel, in order for Israel to take risks for peace, we have to provide assurances. Israel has to be made to feel secure militarily, politically, economically, ideologically, and otherwise before they can take risks for peace. This is the formula that has been pushed since the beginning of the Oslo process. And so that's one, what I consider a very faulty assumption of American mediation. The other has been that Palestinian politics, for the most part, can be either ignored or perhaps even better, it can be re-engineered to kind of fit the goals of the peace process as imagined by the United States. And so this is what I call the blind spot, this inability to deal with the power asymmetry between the two sides. They kept sort of, they treated the Palestinians as though they were somehow an equal party, as if they had equal ability to influence realities on the ground, when clearly that's not the case. And at the same time, where there is there's extraordinary deference to internal Israeli politics, and almost zero deference to Palestinian internal politics, to the point that even when Palestinians had a civil war and the Palestinian leadership was at its weakest point ever, that was the moment that they decided, that the Bush administration decided would be the perfect moment to launch permanent status negotiations with Israel. Of course, those negotiations didn't succeed. And we've seen over and over again how Palestinian weakness has paralyzed them. And people wonder, well, why didn't they respond to Kerry's proposal, or why didn't they respond to this? Because the leadership is so weak, they are completely paralyzed. Because I mean, it's just common sense that if you are a divided leadership, as they were, you don't have public opinion on your side. You have a very vocal opposition, a violent opposition, even in the form of Hamas. You are going to be very, very reluctant to make these kinds of sweeping compromises. So there are many, many examples of how the U.S. Mediation consistently failed, from Camp David. I'm just going to highlight two, and then leave it at that. But Camp David under the Clinton administration, when that summit failed, even though the United States had promised Arafat and the PLO that they would not blame them if the summit failed, they did. And then when violence broke out, even though both sides were clearly involved in stoking the violence, particularly the Israeli side, frankly, because they had from a very early stage overreacted and kind of launched, very much like what we see now. They used the military response to respond to riots, and so it effectively militarized the Palestinian uprising in 2000. And so even though all sides made mistakes, the United States only blamed Arafat and the Palestinians. It's been well documented, both the negotiations and how the violence of the Second Intifada erupted. So even though we can understand the politics of this, there's a special relationship with Israel. If I'm Bill Clinton, I'm not going to blame myself, and I'm not going to blame my best friend, the Israelis. It's always easier to blame the Palestinians. And so this is the calculation that is made over and over and over again. Whenever there is a cost to pay, something goes wrong, negotiations, there's violence, talks break down, it's always the path of least resistance is to blame the Palestinians, who are the weakest party in this whole equation. And so essentially over the years, what American mediation has done is actually deepened the asymmetry in power between the two sides by ensuring that Palestinians were always held accountable. Look at how many hearings, how many sanctions imposed by Congress, Palestinian textbooks are scrutinized for every, instance of anything that could be seen as anti-Semitic. There is zero scrutiny of Israeli textbooks. There is zero sanction for Israeli violations of signed agreements, but also of international law or human rights standards. There's never been any accountability for the Israeli side, whereas the Palestinian side has faced numerous sanctions even before Donald Trump came along. And so it's not just that the US failed in its mediation, it's that American mediation actually made an agreement more difficult to achieve and the situation on the ground worse. That peace process actually deepened the power imbalance and exacerbated the conflict. We see that again in a recurring cycle in Gaza and Jerusalem especially. And it also further weakened Palestinian political leaders and institutions. Again, I'm not trying to let Palestinians off the hook. Their internal dysfunction, a whole lot of it is self-inflicted, but it has been exacerbated by a very clear Israeli strategy of divide and rule. Israel has an interest in fragmenting and dividing Palestinians. The problem isn't in that, it's that in the United States has consistently facilitated and in some cases, openly endorsed that approach. And that's why American mediation has failed.
I have a lot of questions, thank you, but so do our audience. And so in order to try to get to as many of them as we can, I'm seeing a couple actually crop up about whether or not there's the idea of a one-state solution has any legs, whether it's some sort of federation, something composed of two nations, Jewish and Muslim, or something of the sort. So that's come up a couple of times. Is there some sort of one-state solution that's possible?
Yeah, I think now that people are realizing that a two-state solution is not going to happen because you can't unscramble the egg is the metaphor that is often used. You have 700,000 Israeli settlers. It was extremely difficult for Israel politically to evacuate 9,000 settlers from the Gaza Strip in 2005. Imagine not just uprooting hundreds of thousands of Israelis from the West Bank, but from the most biblically sensitive areas of Judea and Samaria. In addition to dividing Jerusalem and handing over sovereignty to Palestinians in the most important parts of Jerusalem. I see this as a really almost impossibility. And so it's natural that people start thinking about alternatives to a two-state solution. And one state is one that is quite popular and is growing in its popularity. Not so much between Jews and Muslims because, the Palestinians are both Christian and Muslim, and a smidge of others like Samaritans, but they're tiny. Really looking at that first map of 6.9 million or 6.8 million Jews and 6.8 million Arabs in this entire land and saying everyone between the river and the sea should have equal rights as equal citizens. Same you could, but since Israel doesn't look like it's going to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza or East Jerusalem anytime soon, the only feasible solution is one state. That is an idea that I think is gaining currency, but it hasn't matured yet. We don't have a political movement either on the Palestinian side or the Israeli side that is working toward that goal. There's no political party that is working for a one-state solution. I think there's another set of options of confederation, sort of reimagining two states where you have, instead of a hard border between a future Israel and Palestine, you have an open border wherever it is. Let's say the 1967 line, because that's the one that is most acceptable from an international law standpoint. But you have free movement between the two sides. You have the ability of Palestinians to reside in Israel, even though they won't vote in Israeli elections, and vice versa. And so there, instead of unscrambling the egg, you're just simply redefining the yolk versus the whites, to continue the bad metaphor. And so you keep the egg intact, but without, without the hard borders. And that's another option that I think people are beginning to explore more seriously. But again, it's going to be a while before we see a critical mass around either one state or confederation models. But I do think that people are coming to the conclusion that two states is no longer, two states as traditionally imagined with hard borders is not something that can be achieved.
Okay, thank you. We have an interesting question here that's kind of taking it in another direction, right? And sort of the idea of entrenched conflicts that get caused. And the questioner is asking whether or not they think it's normal that the IDF needs to call everyone in a building prior to bombing Hamas in order to give Palestinian civilians time to leave. So, and the question is, is there a way to, how do you deal with that if Hamas is launching missiles from kindergartens and schools, and why should Israel always be the one to step back?
Well, there's a bunch of assumptions that are loaded into that question that I'm not sure that I would agree with. I mean, first of all, Israel controls the Gaza Strip. I know the Israelis like to say they left, they ended the occupation, but any serious legal scholar will tell you the Gaza Strip is still occupied by Israel, even can fish in the Mediterranean Sea. That is one of the elements of the ceasefire agreement, to extend the fishing zone. Not sure how allowing Palestinians to catch more fish is in any way a security threat to Israel, but in any case, this is what Israel controls. They control the population registry in Gaza. Every child that is born in Gaza is registered with the registry in Israel, because Israel, again, controls who comes in and out of the Gaza Strip. So Israel has a responsibility under international law to take care of the population in the Gaza Strip. Now, the rockets are, Hamas launching rockets is reprehensible, because the rockets themselves are so crude and indiscriminate. Fortunately, Israel has the technology to protect most of its citizens, and so the vast majority of those rockets never hit any targets, human or otherwise. The Palestinians have no Iron Dome. They have no bunkers, underground shelters to protect them. They have no way, there's no place for them to evacuate to. It's one of the most densely populated areas in the world. I think the evidence that Hamas, I've seen all these, this has become a standard talking point of, Hamas firing or using Palestinian civilians as human shields. This is a very popular talking point, but there's not a lot of evidence to support it. The reality is that Gaza is extremely densely populated. It would be almost impossible to have, if you're going to have rocket launching facilities from someplace, it's almost impossible to find an area, that is entirely open and free of civilians. And of course, Hamas understands this, and so they do bear a certain responsibility when they launch rockets and they understand that Israel will respond. But the original sin here is not the rockets. The original sin is Israel's control over Palestinian lives for 54 years. And in the case of the Gaza Strip, it is much more severe because the Gaza has been under a suffocating blockade. More than half of Gaza's workforce is unemployed. So imagine the kind of instability that that would cause. 97% of Gaza's water is unfit for human consumption. 70% of Gaza's population live off of the charitable donations of donor countries, mainly through UNRWA, the UN agency that supports the refugees. So there is not a security need to keep Gaza under this kind of suffocating blockade. It is a form of collective punishment. It is something, frankly, to the shame of the international community to have even acquiesced in this for as long as it has. So while the rockets are terrible, the rockets are also the only way that there's been any change in the blockade regime in Gaza. It is a sad reality that improvements in imports and exports and the opening and closure of border crossings has only happened after moments of violence like what we just saw. And so the reality is that violence works. If you're Hamas, the calculation is my counterparts in Fatah, their approach to negotiations has gotten them nowhere. It's been, this is now year 27 of a 5-year interim deal. They were supposed to have a Palestinian state by 1999 or 2000 at the latest. So the calculation has been, you negotiations guys have failed. It gets you nowhere. Our way gets results, even if we have to pay a price to get it. That's the logic of asymmetrical warfare, is the weaker side will say, even if I pay a heavier price, at least making the stronger party pay any sort of a price is worth it, because otherwise the status quo will continue indefinitely, and the status quo is very comfortable for Israelis. So when Israeli leadership says we want quiet for quiet, it's not really quiet for quiet. The Israelis will go back to work, go back to the beaches, go back to normal life. Palestinians don't go back to anything resembling normal, particularly in Gaza. So as long as we have a blockade, we are sadly going to see things like rockets.
Thank you, Khaled. That was a good response, I think, to a tough question. And there's a lot of I think there's a lot more that we can all learn about this situation. Unfortunately, we can't do it today because we've reached just about time. But I want to say thank you so much. I think this was really an incredible insight into a very complex situation, and we don't always get to go a few levels down. And so you really laid out a lot of the just the politics of it very, very nicely. So thank you. I learned a lot. And thank you to everyone in the audience. There were great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. Just as a heads up, our next briefing is on Ethiopia and Tigray and why the conflict matters for the Horn of Africa, and also not just the Horn of Africa, but more broadly. So please do join us. That's Thursday, June 17th, from 12 to 1. So that's this Thursday. You can RSVP there. And again, thank you everyone for joining. And thank you, Khaled. To those of you who don't know, we are a nonprofit. We're trying to keep these virtual briefings free and open to everyone around the world. So if you are able to donate, please do. We really want to keep this going. So to everyone who attended, Khaled especially, thank you so much for this today. I really, really enjoyed getting to speak to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.